Episode 5. Faith without denial. Welcome back. Today we're talking about something that has become very important to me on this journey. Faith without denial. When I was diagnosed with MDS, I had a choice. I could pretend it wasn't serious, or I could face it fully and still trust God. I chose the second, because faith is not pretending something isn't real or that the danger isn't there. Faith is trusting God in the middle of what is real. There was a moment after my diagnosis that still feels very close to me. I remember sitting with my lab results in my hands, just staring at the numbers, and even if you don't fully understand every detail, you know this is something serious. My body felt weak, but in that moment, it wasn't just physical. It was like the weight of reality settled in all at once. This is serious. This is my life now. And I remember thinking about everything. My future, my family, all the unknowns that no one really can ever prepare you for. And if I'm completely honest, I was afraid. Not a loud, panicking fear, but a quiet, heavy fear that just sits on you. And I had this thought, if I really have faith, should I even feel this? Because sometimes we think that faith means we're not supposed to feel fear. Like if we're strong enough spiritually, we won't struggle emotionally. But in that moment, I realized something so important. God wasn't asking me to pretend. He was inviting me to come to Him as I was. So I did. No perfect words, no polished prayer, just honesty. God, I'm scared. I don't understand this, but I trust you. And I can't explain it any other way except this. Nothing around me changed. The diagnosis didn't change. The uncertainty didn't go away. But something inside me shifted. It was like the fear loosened its grip for peace to come in. A steady, quiet assurance. Like God was reminding me, you don't have to carry this alone. He told me that my steps were ordered by Him. And that moment changed how I see faith. Faith isn't denying reality. Faith is facing reality with God. Faith is not ignoring facts. Let me say this clearly. Faith is not ignoring facts. I believe in healing. I have seen so many healings over my life. I believe in miracles. I've seen plenty. I believe God intervenes. He's shown it time and time again. But I also believe in blood tests, in bone marrow biopsies, and treatment plans. Let me share a moment where this became very real for me. I shared in the last podcast about my birthday last year and the decision to celebrate even though it looked much different than before. I knew my hemoglobin was low, but decided to wait until the next day to get treatment. I was shocked when my blood work showed my hemoglobin had dropped to a 5.6. I have learned since then to seek help before my hemoglobin drops that low. If you've ever dealt with blood disorders, you know that number is dangerously low. My body felt it. I was exhausted in a way that sleep could not fix. Walking across the room made my heart race. Even simple things like standing up made me dizzy. My body was clearly telling me something was wrong. Now this is where faith without denial becomes important. I could have said, I'm not claiming that number. I'm not receiving that report. I'm just believing for healing. But that would not have been faith. That would have been denial. Instead, I trusted God and received the transfusions that my body needed, because God doesn't always do miraculous healings, but sometimes He puts the right people, treatments, or resources in front of you to use. So I prayed, I trusted, and I also allowed the doctors to do their work, because God's provision sometimes looks like a miracle, and sometimes it looks like a nurse hanging bags of blood that someone generously donated. Both can be grace. That moment reminded me that trusting God doesn't mean ignoring the reality of our condition. It means walking through it with Him. There is something very humbling about illness. It strips away the illusion that we are in control. It forces us to depend on things outside ourselves, doctors, treatments, donors, and most of all, God. But that dependence can also become something beautiful. Because the more aware I became of my physical weakness, the more aware I became of God's sustaining strength. Not dramatic strength, but quiet strength. The strength to get through the next appointment. The strength to process another lab result. The strength to keep trusting even when the future is uncertain. So if you are walking through illness, whether it's MDS or something else, remember this: faith does not require you to deny the diagnosis. It invites you to face it with God beside you. Because the numbers on the lab report may describe your condition, but they do not determine your hope. I receive transfusions when needed. When my platelets drop, I take precautions. When my neutrophils are low, I'm careful. That is not lack of faith. That is wisdom. In Proverbs 4:7 it says, "Wisdom is the principal thing, therefore get wisdom." Faith and wisdom are not enemies. They walk together. God often works through wisdom, not instead of it. Doctors can be instruments of healing. Medicine can be a provision. Treatment can be part of God's care for us. Trusting God does not mean rejecting help. Sometimes trusting God means accepting it. Denial is fear wearing makeup. Sometimes what looks like faith is actually fear. It sounds like this: I'm not claiming that. I'm not receiving that. I'm not even going to say the word. But avoiding reality does not make it disappear. It just makes you unprepared. Denial tries to protect you from pain, but it usually ends up increasing anxiety, because deep down we know the truth is still there. There's a verse in Psalm 56 verse 3 that says, "When I am afraid, I put my trust in you." It doesn't say if I am afraid. It says when. Fear will show up, but it doesn't get the final word. Faith is different. Faith does not hide from the truth. Faith looks at the truth and says, God is bigger than this. Denial is fragile, but faith is steady. Denial requires constant effort, where faith rests. The moment I felt peace instead of fear. I remember a moment on this journey that surprised me. It was early in the process, when the tests were still unfolding and the doctors were starting to put the pieces together. Words like bone marrow biopsy and blood disorder were being mentioned. Anyone who has walked that road knows those are heavy words. Naturally, you would expect fear, but something unexpected happened. Instead of fear, I felt peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from understanding everything, because I didn't understand everything. I didn't know what the future would hold. I didn't know how serious this would become. I didn't know what treatment might look like. But in the middle of all that uncertainty, there was a calming presence in my spirit, a steady assurance that said, God already knew about this. Before the first abnormal blood test, before the first doctor's appointment, before the words Myelodysplastic Syndrome were ever spoken. And if he already knew, then he was already present in the middle of it. That realization changed everything. Because when you know God is already there, the unknown loses some of its power to frighten you. The diagnosis didn't disappear. The uncertainty didn't disappear. But fear no longer had the loudest voice. Peace did. Isaiah 26:3, you will keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you because he trusts in you. And that peace did not come from my circumstances. It came from knowing that no matter what this journey would look like, I would not walk it alone. That moment showed me something important. Faith without denial does not remove reality, but it changes how you walk through it. Jesus acknowledged reality. When I look at Jesus, I see something powerful. He acknowledged storms. He acknowledged sickness. He acknowledged suffering. But he was never ruled by them. In Mark 4, when the storm came, the disciples panicked. The wind was real. The waves were real. The danger was real. Jesus didn't deny the storm's existence. He simply calmed it. There is a difference between ignoring a storm and speaking peace into it. Faith does not require us to say the storm is small or that there is no storm. Faith reminds us God is greater. My diagnosis does not threaten my faith. When I received the diagnosis of MDS, my faith did not crumble. I felt peace, not because I believed it wasn't serious, but because I believed God was not surprised. Faith says, this is real and God is still good. Faith says, this is hard and I am still held. Faith does not require fantasy. It requires trust. And sometimes the most powerful form of faith is simply saying, God, I don't understand this, but I trust you. Holding two things at once. This journey has taught me I can hold two things at once. I can acknowledge the severity of low blood counts and still believe for stability and strength. I can admit fatigue and still walk in gratitude. I can follow medical advice and still pray boldly. I can prepare for treatment and still believe God is working. That is mature faith. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady. In 2 Corinthians 5 verse 7 it says, for we walk by faith, not by sight. Walking by faith does not mean we are blind. It means sight does not have the final word. The lab report may speak, but it does not speak louder than God. Faith in the waiting. Another place denial sometimes shows up is in the waiting. Waiting for lab results, waiting for appointments, waiting for treatment plans. Those spaces can be uncomfortable. Denial tries to fill that space with distraction. Faith fills that space with trust. Sometimes faith is not dramatic. Sometimes faith is simply waking up in the morning and saying, God, give me the strength for today. Not for next year, not for the entire journey, just for today. And then discovering that His grace really is enough for the day that you're living. If you feel pressured to be strong, maybe you have felt this. The pressure to sound positive, the pressure to never admit fear, the pressure to declare victory every second. That can be exhausting. But God is not intimidated by honesty. In Psalm 62:8 it says, "Pour out your heart before Him. God is a refuge for us." He already knows. Faith without denial says, "I am scared sometimes. I don't understand everything, but I trust you." That kind of faith is real. And real faith is resilient. The balance. Here is what I've learned. Denial avoids. Faith engages. Denial suppresses. Faith steadies. Denial says, "It's not happening." Faith says, "It's happening, and I am not alone." And I would rather stand in reality with God than hide from reality without Him. If you are walking through something difficult right now, I want you to hear this clearly. You do not have to pretend it isn't happening. You do not have to silence the hard parts of your story. You do not have to spiritually decorate your pain. Real faith is honest. Real faith can sit in a doctor's office and hear difficult words. Real faith can look at a lab report and acknowledge the numbers. Real faith can admit weakness and still trust God. That is what this journey with MDS has taught me. Faith does not require me to deny the diagnosis. It invites me to walk through it with God beside me. Someday, faith looks like prayer. Some days, it looks like gratitude. And some days, it looks like simply taking the next step when the road feels uncertain. But through every lab result, every appointment, every moment of waiting, one truth has stayed constant. God was already there, before the diagnosis, before the questions, before the fear tried to knock. And if God is already present in my future, then I can walk toward it with peace. Not because I know exactly how the story will unfold, but because I know who is writing it. So if you're walking through your own storm right now, remember this. You don't need faith that denies reality. You need faith that anchors you in the middle of it. Faith anchors you to the one who stands above it. And that kind of faith is steady. It is resilient. And it will carry you farther than you ever imagined. If this resonated with something you've been feeling, share it with someone who needs permission to have faith without denial. Like it by clicking the thumbs up, subscribe and follow me by clicking the bell sign. This will help me reach more people. Until next time, stay anchored.